Good evening, everyone. I'm Vanitha Rao here. I represent Sunshine Autism Trust and Little Newton Project in Bangalore. I am really grateful to Autism Connect for making this webinar possible. Today, we'll be talking about storytelling and autism spectrum disorder. Autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, is a disorder where individuals have impairments in social communication and interaction, along with restricted repetitive behaviors. So, just briefly, let's try and understand what this is about. Social communication and interaction essentially means that there'll be difficulties in learning language, difficulties in using the language they've learned, difficulties in joint attention, that is listening to and relating to people, where, when you try to talk to them about something, they need to connect to what you're talking about. Then, of course, there are difficulties in socialization, particularly in peer interaction. And the next aspect, restricted and repetitive behaviors, which can include stereotypical behaviors like hand flapping, body rocking. Then many children or individuals on the autism spectrum will have a narrow range of interests. They may like only a specific thing, and like, for instance, they may like only cars and not be interested in talking about anything else. And they may have a tendency to get caught up in details. These are some of the features that you see as part of the restricted and repetitive behaviors. So what this essentially means is that if an individual has autism spectrum disorder, it impacts the way in which the individual learns language and communication. They have difficulty learning to speak, and it impacts the way in which the individual views the world. They have difficulty in trying to understand the world that they live in. They have difficulty in trying to relate to the world that they live in. It impacts an understanding of emotions. When we say this does not mean, like a lot of people tend to think, that the child does not show emotions or does not really understand when you're angry. What they have is a difficulty in probably understanding exactly how to behave when you're angry, how to react to your emotions, and sometimes they may not express their emotions appropriately. It results in a lot of behavioral challenges for the child or the individual on the autism spectrum. And these behavioral challenges are what most people tend to talk about. So once an individual has something like this, a disorder like this, one needs to find as many alternative methods as possible for the individual to attain his or her full potential. So we may need to look out there for what will work best for each child. As I mentioned earlier, it's a spectrum disorder, meaning no two children are alike. So one may need to explore as many methods as possible to see what is the best fit for every individual child. Today, we're going to talk about using storytelling as a method to help teach the child. Storytelling is basically an interactive art of using words and actions to reveal the elements and images of a story while encouraging the listener's imagination. It is one of the most ancient forms of passing on information. In fact, it even predates writing. I'm sure all of you have heard of hieroglyphics on rock walls, which told a story to us about the ancient people who lived there. Now, storytelling uses words. It's an extremely interactive form of teaching. It uses actions, gestures, vocalization, it uses body movements, it uses dramatic voice modulation, and in doing all this, it presents a narrative. It tells you something. It tells you a sequence of events. It encourages the imagination. It leads you to think about what can be, what might be, and what could have happened. There are various storytelling techniques that people tend to use. Some of these are very commonly taught in preschool, uh, taught to preschool educators, if they're taught to special educators. And we learn different kinds of techniques when we're doing our education courses. I've just briefly outlined a few, like picture books, flashcards, through movement, or enacting a story with little toys and using hand puppets. You'll notice I've not put down video or film as one of the mediums, though it's very much a medium of storytelling. The reason I have not put that down is because here we're talking about using storytelling with individuals on the autism spectrum. So we're also looking at engaging them and interacting with them. And if we're going to use videos or films, which most individuals on the autism spectrum would really enjoy, we are not really engaging with them. We're not interacting with them. So maybe we can use that once in a while in order to keep the child engaged. But when we want to use it to teach something, some of these techniques would be much better to use. I'm going to go through a couple of these techniques and talk to you about how we can look for the right books or the right flashcards for the child, specifically for the child on the autism spectrum. When it comes to picture books, I would ideally recommend something which has one picture and one line, something like this, which has just one picture and one line. And then we could also look at, here's another one, which is one picture with 3-4 lines. There's a reason for this. Ideal picture books, one picture accompanied by one or a few lines, very clear pictures and short stories, so that the child's attention is completely engaged in the story. Then you can have stick puppets, like this one which I have put up over here. It's a simple little thing where I have just taken a printout, laminated it, and stuck it on an ice cream stick. And we can use flashcards. Always remember the flashcards. It should have simple pictures again, clear storylines, small to medium-sized cards. Once in a special education class, I actually saw the teacher using this large card, which she could barely hold. And she had to hold the cards and also control the children in front of her who kept running around. I would really recommend that you always remember the audience that you are working with. If you're looking at children on the autism spectrum, they tend to be extremely hyperactive. So you should be able to hold what you're using in order to teach the child. You can't be, holding something so large that you can't control the children. And of course, ideally, your story should not have more than 6 to 7 cards. And then there are hand puppets. Sometimes some children on the autism spectrum might get a little perturbed by this, particularly the younger ones. And you might need to introduce this very slowly. But I like hand puppets because, ideally when you are doing the story, you have 2 hand puppets because you have 2 hands. And you just have 2 characters, and you can really make a good story using 2 characters. And that will make the story that much more easier for the child rather than a story which has multiple characters. Then we have toys. We can use toys laid out in front of them, in front of the child, in order to tell a story. At this point of time, you could really use the kind of toys that the child really likes. There are, what you can see here, what I've put up here is the Peppa Pig family. highly popular with a lot of our young children, where they love Peppa Pig and all the things that she does. Using these little toys, you could move them around on the table, where Peppa Pig takes a bus, goes to school, etc. And this will really help the child understand the story. When you're using toys, a few things to remember. Use fewer toys to reduce distractibility. Allow the child to play with the toys after you've finished your story. Because quite often, if you've handed the toy over to the child, then he's busy with it and he's not really listening to you. And, the whole point of you trying to tell the story is lost. Avoid objects that the child might get obsessed about because your learning objective might get lost. I just said that a lot of children like Peppa Pig, but if it's a child who might just want to hold on to Peppa Pig and not listen to your story, then your objective is lost. You'll have to take these decisions on a child-to-child basis and decide what kind of toy would work, and if at all, a toy would work. For some children, maybe just flashcards would be a much better option, or for some children, a book might be a much better option. Here are again some toys that you can use to relate a little story. This is a family with a father, a mother, and a little child. So coming to some features of ASD to keep in mind while modifying the storytelling style. Now, what do we know? I have just put down a few features here, not all the features. These are the features which I felt that we need to keep in mind as we modify our storytelling for individuals on the autism spectrum. First and foremost, they are visual learners. They think visually, they think in pictures. They can understand anything that they see much, much better than they can understand what they hear. So I know a lot of people would like to try and tell a story without creating the visuals because it's that much easier. But what we need to remember is if we haven't created the visuals, then you are probably not getting the whole point across. Maybe the child is grasping part of your objective, or maybe the child is not grasping any of your objective when you're trying to just verbally tell him. And he's also not engaged with you because there's nothing for him to see. Then we have to remember the child has limited language skills. So we need to know, we need to take into account how much language does the child understand before we make a decision on the storytelling. And the third thing that we need to remember is that the child has literal thinking. He tends to interpret whatever you say very literally. So when you are telling stories, if you're using a lot of idioms, a lot of phrases which the child can misinterpret, you need to be really careful with your language there. The fourth point to remember is that most children on the autism spectrum tend to have poor attention span. So you cannot have an extremely long-winded story because you might lose him halfway through. In fact, there have been times when if the story has been a little long, you lose the child within the second line of the story. So make sure that your stories are short. Then, the fifth aspect to remember is that children have poor theory of mind. What this means is that they have difficulty in they have difficulty in understanding other people's minds. They have difficulty in understanding what the other person is thinking, liking, believing. And now stories are all about different characters and how they are reacting or how they are behaving for different instances. So this is something which is challenging for a child with autism. And you may need to scale up on the emotional aspects of stories as you introduce it to the child. Start off with something extremely simple and then move on to the complex emotions in a story. Another thing that they have difficulty is in sequencing. I felt I needed to put this down because a story is essentially a sequence of instances, a sequence of events. So a child might have difficulty in sequencing all the events if you're going to have too many sequences, if you are going to have too many events happening within one single story. So we need to be very clear on the sequencing story. Coming now to the key aspect, some of the modifications required with children with some of the modifications required in storytelling for children with ASD. These are the things that I'm going to be discussing in detail. Length of the story. The story needs to be concrete rather than abstract. Visual aids, declarative language, voice modulation and facial expression, use of rhythm, single concept, developmental level, and of course, element of fun and joy. The first aspect, short and to the point. Stories need to be short. Most children on the autism spectrum have very short attention spans and limited language skills. So you can't really have a long-winded story where multiple events are taking place, multiple characters are there in the story. We need to make sure that we have fewer characters and just maybe one little event to begin with. As the children get more and more, advanced in their development, you can look at stories which are longer, which have multiple events and multiple characters. But initially, when you start, make sure that it's short and to the point. Concrete versus abstract. Stories need to be having concrete plots, something that the child can relate to. It can just be little events of the day which can be put into a little story for the child. And since children on the autism spectrum have a very literal understanding, you need to make sure that you are giving them the points in a very clear manner. Abstract concepts can be hard for them to understand, or they may even misunderstand it. Fairy tales can be meaningless for many children on the autism spectrum. Yes, no doubt there are a lot of children, especially the higher functioning ones, who may enjoy a fairy tale and who may even get hooked onto reading fairy tales. But often they may not really understand the whole concept that this is imaginary. They may take the wrong end of the stick when you're trying to present it to them. So I would really use caution when I'm using fairy tales because I might want to make sure that the child has understood the difference between real and imaginary before I actually introduce a fairy tale to the child. A lot of them, remember, I have said, take things very literally. So when you talk about, say, the evil man in the story, that can be very frightening to a child who takes things literally. So we have to be a little careful. Again, as I said, it's a wide spectrum, and there could be individuals who need to be a little more, where you need to be a little more careful about what they can understand and what they cannot understand. And as I had been saying from the beginning, stories need to be visual. Children on the autism spectrum have very strong visual skills and tend to have poorer language skills. Expecting them to imagine the story can be extremely difficult. Yes, we want to eventually develop this imagination in the child. But once we start using the stories in the initial days, it has to be visual. You'll find that if you are just relating something to them, they just want to switch off because they don't understand. I think if you look at the different methods of therapy, like whether it is relationship development intervention or a structured teaching, all of them tell you use more visuals and use less verbal bombardment. The more verbal bombardment you use, the less the child is listening to you. And of course, once you need to also keep mind the language level of the child, the developmental level of the child. And then the kind of language that we use. Definitely, declarative language is recommended. It's one of the best practices in all therapy, in most of the therapies in autism, where you use statements. What we mean by declarative languages is basically these are statements. So you reduce or avoid questions and demands when you're telling the story. Oftentimes, you'll find in a neurotypical preschool that when they're telling stories to the children, they tend to ask them a lot of questions related to what happened, then what happened next, who said this, who did that, where did they go, when, and why. Now, these are all verbal demands for a child with autism. Maybe it will be much better when you start off with stories to just relate the stories to them and not keep asking them questions. Again, in typical neurotypical preschools, there's a tendency to finish the story and then have a recap where you're asking the children the questions. Quite often, our children don't really like it. It's better that we just tell them the story and be done with it. So limit your demands and use more declarative language, use more statements, so that the child feels more comfortable. He's taking it in, he will learn it, and you will find his responses as time goes by. Coming to voice modulation and facial expressions. A key aspect of storytelling is the storyteller's voice modulation and facial expressions. We really need to practice this. Unless and until we use a lot of emotion in our voice, the child is not going to really get engaged in the story. Children love the different voices that you use in order to relate the different stories. If you have two characters, you need to have two different voices when you're relating the story. And you need to have the appropriate facial expressions. For a child on the autism spectrum, maybe you need to exaggerate it a little more, especially the facial expressions. I find that most children on the autism spectrum, if you keep exaggerating the facial expressions, they tune in a lot better to you. They listen to you that much better. So your voice modulations and facial expressions is something that one needs to practice when one wants to be a good storyteller. You'll find that good storytellers are always very engaging in their voice. It's the voice that makes a big difference, not so much the way the book looks or the picture looks. It's the voice that makes the child engage with you. And remember, we're talking about children with autism who have difficulty in engaging with you. The better your voice modulation, the better the child engages with you. And once he's engaged with you once he's engaged with you and connected with you well, you'll find a whole lot of other learning happens beautifully as time goes by. And using rhythm. This is something I have tried a lot and found that children on the autism spectrum connect beautifully to rhythm. And I'm talking about also children who don't have very good understanding of a language, who still are having very limited language skills, but they connect to the rhythm. I'm sure you've heard of a lot of children who, when they hear a catchy tune, they'll come running to the television because they heard the tune that they connect to. And this can be a child who has absolutely no language skills. So you'll find that rhythm is something that they connect to. And the best part about rhythm is that it helps to inculcate phonemic awareness. So using rhymes in the form of stories to engage with the child is also a fantastic thing to do. Like, for instance, I've got a little doll here, and I want to give you an idea. For instance, we have a very popular rhyme which says, "This is the way we brush our teeth." All you have is a doll, and this is the way we brush our teeth. You sing it out, and the child is engaged with you. You can have text in books, which is in the form of rhymes, and that will also engage with the child very, very well. Then a single concept in one story. Once you start off with storytelling, always try to have one single concept that the story is trying to tell. Like for instance, this book that I was just showing you, it says Jock the Croc brushes his teeth. So there's just one concept where the child, where the crocodile is learning to brush his teeth. And there's no other concept that you're trying to inculcate in that book. I also don't like books which have, multiple stories within the same book. Because what happens is the child, most children with autism, once you pick up a book, they want to finish it from the beginning to the end. So if the book is very long or if it has multiple stories, they tend to get confused because you're trying to present too many concepts. Now, this single concept that you're presenting is something that you do even in your teaching. If you're teaching number concept, at that point of time, to a child with autism, you're teaching only number concept. You're not trying to teach two, three different things there. So, one thing to remember, a single concept in one story. Then coming to the developmental level. We need to know the child's developmental level before we can take a call on what kind of a story is perfect for this child. And very often, using stories for a child who has very, very poor language skills may not be suitable at all. The child may need to have some amount of minimum language skills before you actually introduce stories to this child. He may need to be having a good receptive vocabulary of nouns. He will also need a sufficient vocabulary of action words before you can actually use stories. Because remember, a story will have some amount of action. And if the child does not have an understanding of both nouns and action words, he's not going to understand the story. And he's not going to be able to sequence the different events, and the whole purpose is lost. So keep in mind the development level of the child before you start introducing stories, and keep in mind the developmental level of the child when you want to scale up the different kinds of stories from one level to the other. And above all, make it fun for the child. If you're aiming to teach some behavior, just state it and don't preach. All these moral stories that we hear about, just not suitable for our children. They're not getting the point. All you need to do is just state the different behaviors that you would like the child to pick up, and don't go into this. What did they say? Don't hit, don't do this, don't do that, whatever. Don't keep saying this and don't keep asking the child. So what is good behavior? He really doesn't want to get into that. He just wants to know what story you're talking about. So just make it fun. Don't spend your time preaching about what's right, what's wrong, is this good behavior, is that bad behavior. Believe me, no child is really interested in going into those details. But yes, if you just state it and leave it, he's going to pick it up at some point of time. Now coming to the next aspect, benefits of storytelling. It helps bring about some understanding of phonetics when you read aloud rhyming text. Because phonetics or phonemic awareness is something that most children on the autism spectrum have a lot of challenges with. They tend to not be able to relate to what I'm talking about here is they're not able to relate to the letters and the sounds, the letter sound association. So if you're reading out rhymes regularly, they tend to like that. They like to, as they listen to it, they start becoming aware of the rhymes. And for this, you need to read it out appropriately for the child. And then he gets to start understanding the rhythm in the text. It definitely improves vocabulary. It's an engaging way to teach new words to the children. You don't have to necessarily look for books where the child understands every word. There could be a few words that the child doesn't understand. And as you read it out with the appropriate pictures, he'll start understanding the new words as you're teaching him. And definitely, all of us love reading, love stories as a way to learn new words. Whereas you try and read the textbook out to a child, you've lost his attention in no time at all. Sorry, this is not moving forward. I'm not sure what happened. Yeah. Reduces behavior problems. Social stories also, I think all of you who are familiar with autism would have heard about social stories. It's a medium of teaching behaviors to children with autism. And this is a very proactive way of teaching appropriate behaviors. And they are known to, and research has shown this, they're known to help reduce various behaviors. So in a social story, what you're essentially doing is you are telling the child the right kind of behavior to do in a particular situation. Again, remember, one single concept at a time. So when you're trying to use social stories to reduce behavior problems, always tackle only one single behavior in one single social story. And don't have too many things within that particular story. And what else does it do? It improves expressive language and narrationability. Narration is basically the ability to tell you a sequence of things. Like, for instance, narrating what happened at school today. You'll find initially most children on the autism spectrum tend to just tell you, if you ask them a question, what did you do in school today? You'll get a rote answer. I did coloring, or teacher did something. So you don't really get to hear what are the different events that happened in the school. Now, if you're telling the child stories multiple on a regular basis, you'll find that they learn to narrate things. First, they may only learn to narrate what they have heard from the stories that they have heard, but eventually they start learning to narrate things from their daily lives. So it makes language learning that much more interesting for the child, and it helps them narrate things. And since you're using a lot of declarative language, the child will also learn to use the declarative language in order to narrate. After all, that's what we do when we are narrating. When we narrate a story, we're using declarative language. And it improves understanding of theory of mind. What other people like, what they think, feel, and believe. Understanding what another person feels, likes, and wants is what constitutes theory of mind. And remember, this is a key challenge for individuals on the autism spectrum. So when we're telling them stories, we're telling them about different characters in the story. Initially, we may start with just two characters, about how two children went to the park and one child fell and he got hurt and he felt the pain of falling down and getting hurt. So it may start like that, and then the child, as he hears more and more stories, will start understanding the different perspectives. He'll start understanding the perspectives of the different characters, and as he understands the perspectives of characters in the story, he will also start understanding perspectives of characters of people around him. And when we are teaching theory of mind, when we want to actually teach theory of mind, one of the main things that we do is relate different stories to the child with different characters in a sequential manner. And this helps the child develop his theory of mind. And definitely, it helps imitation skills, especially if you're using toys and puppets to relate stories. Like I was talking to you about using a doll to brush the teeth, and you do it for him, and then he can do it too. And he will learn basic imitation skills as you use this to teach him, to tell him stories. You may use dolls, you may use vehicles, and you're going to use it and maybe hand it over to the child later, and he will try and do what you did, thereby improving all his imitation skills. And you're doing this without, doing something so stereotypical like saying, clap hands, and then getting him to clap hands. That's how I see a lot of people trying to teach imitation skills. And that's really not necessary, nor is it fun for the child. Teaching pretend play. Remember, this is one big challenge for children on the autism spectrum. They find it very difficult to do pretend play. While if you're using toys to tell stories, it's one lovely way for you to be doing pretend play in front of the child. And as you do more and more pretend play with the child, he or she will start imitating you and start doing this pretend play. And as he gets more comfortable with this and well versed with doing, uh, you know, enacting little stories with toys, you can start having them doing the enacting themselves. Like, for instance, you might use two little dolls to do, say, the familiar nursery rhyme, Jack and Jill. Put out a few toys, have Jack and Jill go up an imaginary hill, have Jack fall down. And then later on, you can say, come on, now let's try and do that ourselves. You start with something which the child is extremely familiar with, like a nursery rhyme, and you can have them enact these simple stories. And slowly, as they get more comfortable, you can start with something more imaginative, something which they've not heard of earlier. And you'll find that the child will get more and more comfortable with simple pretend play. And then, of course, reading stories develops an interest in reading. And there has been a lot of research, both in the realm of neurotypical children and also with autism spectrum disorder, that if you keep reading to them, they will definitely show more interest in reading. And it's an excellent way to start. I've heard of children, parents who have started reading to their children as young as when they're 1 year old. Maybe they're not understanding much at that point of time, and they're just listening to the voice intonation. They are listening to the different expressions in your voice. But as they get more and more comfortable, they will start showing an interest in books. And once they start showing an interest in books, that's one fantastic way to teach them. So, reading aloud stories is something that I would highly recommend for all parents and teachers. Finally, we're coming to the therapeutic aspects. Relating stories on challenging behaviors or stressful situations in a third person can be extremely therapeutic. A lot of our children face a lot of challenges, especially if they are going into mainstream schools. They may be the subject of bullying. They may have the teacher picking on them because of their challenging behaviors, and they come back with a lot of anxiety. And children on the autism spectrum are they have a natural tendency to be more anxious than other children. And telling them stories, relating stories about challenging behaviors or stressful situations in a third person can be very therapeutic and cathartic for the child. So when you tell them about, a random character, Jack, who got bullied at school, and what he did and how he handled it, can be very comforting for the child, and he will learn to use that in order to uh, improve his own coping skills. So, coming to the end, if you have any questions, I'm open to questions. Just give me a minute. I need to open this out to get the questions. There's a question here which says, I want to know how much you think children in the autism spectrum benefit from storytelling. I would think they do benefit a lot, but as I mentioned earlier, we need to look at uh, what is the developmental level of the child. If the child has a certain amount of language skills, he'll definitely benefit a lot from storytelling. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the questions. If the child, the next question that I have here is, if the child is interested only in animals, can we use pictures with animal characters to tell him stories? Is that good or bad? Yeah, definitely you can use the characters that the child likes. It will help the child understand better. And he will connect to it better if you're using the kind of animals that the child likes. The next question here says, we have good graded storybooks from abroad. How do we customize them to Indian context, and to what, just one minute, to what extent is this required? Customize them to Indian context. Well, to some extent, we do tend to rely very heavily on Western books, and a few books that I have seen here may not be completely suitable, but stories are generally meant to be fiction. So it doesn't really matter what kind of books you're using. I would think that, uh, the couple of points that I was making, where the story for a child with autism needs to be short, it needs to be concrete. If we can look for books which are like that, then that should be sufficient. The next question says, though my child understands social stories, he seems to have behavioral challenges. How should I tweak the social story to help him understand better? Well, you could try to make the statements in the social story very short. I'm not aware of, what is the development level of the child, but you could try to make the statements short. You could ensure that you're tackling only one particular behavior in one story, and you may need to use other techniques as well in order to help control the behaviors. The next question here says, if the child is interested in animations than tactile objects, can we incorporate stories into this, or should stop it? I guess you're talking about what? Video? I'm not sure what the person is asking. But if the person is talking about cartoon pictures, I would think it's fine. But if we are looking at videos, then as I was mentioning, a video may not be that suitable if you're using it to engage with the child. If you're looking at interacting with the child, then something like a video may not be a suitable option. How much is it advisable to repeat stories? I think repetition is fine, because often children love that repetition, and they, uh, listen to you, and maybe they will uh, understand more as you repeat it. So it's a good idea to repeat, is what I would think. Don't we all like to reread stories that we like? I mean, at least readers out there would know that people tend to reread stories as something very comforting. The next question says, usually ASD children are rote learners. So how will I understand that the child will have actually understood the story or it's just rote learning? Well, that's one of the reasons why I'm not very comfortable with uh, fairy tales, because that's where rote learning starts, where the child is not really understanding. And that's again where we need to keep in mind the child's developmental level. He'll definitely be understanding if you are uh, catering to his developmental level. Then he'll be able to understand what you're saying. But yeah, if he keeps repeating the sentences in the same manner over and over again, then he's probably getting it by rote. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the next question. So this is a question which says, the child is 5 years old, he has single word vocabulary, he loves animals, he has too much maladaptive behavior, so taking ABA therapy as well. Uh, please tell me how to implement please tell me how to implement storytelling. Well, you have to look at stories which the child understands. It's maybe a single concept with 4 or 5 lines at the most for this child. From what I can make out, he has limited vocabulary. You could make sure that the storytelling involves animals because you would like that. Maybe the story needs to be extremely simple, where an animal character just does one thing and, like, goes to school, comes back from school, something like that, and start with that and then scale it up a little bit. Do I have any more questions? I see one question which says, can autism be cured? This is not really the platform for this, but what I would like to say is that autism can be helped through therapy and cannot really be cured. Then I have another question which says, will storytelling work in a group? Yes, if the group is homogeneous, that is, children are of the similar level, storytelling will definitely work in a group. But I would suggest that the group be small, with just about maybe 3 to 4 children in the group. It'll definitely help to have storytelling that way. Then, which is best? Someone wants to know, group or individual? I would think individual is better, but group is good too because it will eventually help the child to learn in a group. Then I have another question which says, can you suggest some good books for age 4 to 10 age group? 4 to 10 is a pretty wide range if you're looking at the mental age. I would think if it's a child with autism for age 4, I would go with picture books initially. And age 10 depends again on the developmental level of the child. If it's a child with autism with developmental level of 10, then any books for 10-year-olds should be fine. There's another question which says, is the child allowed to choose a book for us to tell a story? Why ever not? Definitely you can choose what book. You should allow the child to choose his books initially. Maybe you can also make it turn by turn. I choose a book once, you choose a book once. There's another question which says, child is nonverbal, loves stories. If he's nonverbal, I would ideally suggest very short stories for the child. That's another question which says, what's the best way to approach if the child has least sitting tolerance? Maybe if the child's sitting tolerance is poor, then maybe he's not ready for a story. That's also a possibility. That's something that you may want to check out before you decide whether you want to tell a story or not. Another question that says, my son likes to repeat lines of a story that he liked, and that can come in the way of him focusing on studies. So he basically has some amount of repetitive behavior. But I would not, just because he has repetitive behavior, I wouldn't want to stop telling him stories, because that could be his way of improving on his language abilities. There's a question which says, do you suggest the ratio of child with therapist? Well, when it comes to therapy, I would suggest first and foremost 1:1. Maybe once they're more comfortable, 1:3 or 4. There's another question which says, my 8-year-old daughter does not show interest at all when we try to try storytelling. How can we make her interested to listen? I think we would need to actually see the developmental level of the child. If her language abilities are poor, then she may be finding it difficult to relate to stories. I think I've answered this question about group. I think I also answered this question about using videos where I felt I am not too comfortable with that when we want to interact with a child. Regarding what kind of stories are right for kids with ASD, fairy tales or moral stories, I did go into that I'm not too comfortable with fairy tales or moral stories. We need to just state the stories for them. That will help them. Someone wants to know whether it's okay to ask small questions to the child in between the storytelling. You could ask and give a pause and give the answer yourself if you find that the child is not able to answer. Another question says how a trainer can assess how much the child picked up once a particular story is narrated to the child a couple of times. Now, storytelling is mostly for enjoyment, and we don't really need to test them once you've told them the story. The idea of doing storytelling is to improve their overall language ability of the child. Can you give some examples of stories for a verbal child who uses 3 to 4 sentences? Well, I think you'll just have to go out there and look for books, because if I tell you an example, and you may not be able to find those books. And there's my son doesn't like storybooks. He takes storybooks as academic books. He feels he has to study. I think this could be because you may have not used a very declarative approach, and your child must have got used to you asking him questions. So if you stop asking him questions, he may actually enjoy the storybooks. At what stage could we introduce own story writing skills or frame stories orally on their own? Well, I would think that the child needs to be extremely verbal to be able to do this. Only when he has been narrating familiar stories for a while can you start encouraging him to start framing his own stories. Can drawing pictures be used during storytelling? Definitely. I think that would be a fantastic way to engage with the child. Can we use storytelling to deliver subject concept? Yes, definitely. If we are creative enough to make that, maybe it'll be possible. There's another question here. It says, is it okay for the child to be completely involved in the character? For example, she thinks herself as Peppa Pig or Krishna or any character of the story. There's always an age at which children tend to do this, and they may outgrow it. When it's a child on the autism spectrum, he or she may take much longer to outgrow it than a neurotypical. I don't think we should be too concerned about that. Even if a child on the autism spectrum doesn't have enough language skills, can we read him books with rhymes? Yes, you can, because if he's willing to listen to it, yes, you definitely can read it to him. And do role play. Role play may be a little more difficult a concept for him to understand if he's got very limited language skills. Someone says, can you please suggest some storybooks for autism kids? Well, I actually have written some books. You could try that. There's another one which says her visual perception and joint attention is low. So maybe you could use flashcards if the visual perception is low and the book is more challenging. Till what age is storytelling effective? I would think any age. I mean, even adults read stories, right? So any age. If voice is a major component of storytelling, what should its proportion be with respect to visuals? I think when we're dealing with children with autism, we really need to have a lot of visuals. And definitely, of course, your voice modulation should be present. What kind of expectations trainer should keep from a child once a particular story is narrated a couple of times? Um, as I mentioned earlier, I think over a period of time, it may not be one specific story narrated several times, but over a period of time of telling stories, the child's language ability could get better. So that should be your expectation. How does storytelling help non-verbal autistic children? It will help by increasing the verbal inputs for the child so that it can improve his vocabulary development. My son listens to story, but when I ask him to narrate, he says in one word only. Yeah, like I said, try to not get him to narrate because the story needs to be fun. I think I finished that question. 1 second. Can we reduce sensory issues or RRB through stories? Sometimes we can desensitize the child by talking about it through a story. We may need to use other techniques as well. There's another question here. Can we ask the children to ask questions at the end or the middle of the story? Most children on the autism spectrum may not be able to ask you questions. We'll have to be using declarative language in order to help them. One question here says you suggested to start using story in the form of rhymes to bring interest, but ASD children are rigid and they can't accept the change after some point of time if we completely stop rhymed way of telling the story. Well, it depends on the developmental level of the child, and if a rhyme is engaging him, then I would go with that rather than changing the way I am telling him the story. And you may find that as he grows older, he might actually be able to move on to other ways. There's a question which says, how can we continue to attend these sessions on a regular basis? Very helpful. You'll find that Autism Connect does have these sessions on a regular basis. Maybe if you give them your email ID, they will keep you posted. Can you please elaborate more on the use of declarative sentences? Well, this basically means you use statements, you use your language in such a way that the child is able to, you're not asking questions. That's what it means when you say use of declarative language. I've never worked with a child on the autism spectrum, but can story responses of the child project how they are feeling? May not. They may just project, they may just respond in the way they have heard the story. So there's a possibility that you are not really getting what they're feeling. I think I've come to all the end of all the questions, if I'm right. Yeah, there's just one more question. Can we use different types of puppets? Definitely. Any kinds of puppets that you can lay your hands on. Using actions with stories are definitely effective. And no, the child doesn't need to imitate. If he wants to, he can, otherwise he needn't. Someone wants me to elaborate a little bit on social stories. Well, social stories basically are short stories tackling one single behavioral issue that the child has, and where you put out statements which say that, which will tell you what is the expected behavior for the child. How often do we repeat a story? As much as the child wants. Are these stories written by you available on Amazon? Yes, they are. I think I've come to the end of all the questions. There's one more which says, will it be a contradiction using the same object in the story? I'm not sure what exactly that means. I'm sorry. Could you please repeat how we connect to other sessions like this? You need to check out the website, Autism Connect. I think they will be, and give your email ID to them, and they'll keep you posted. How do we understand the child is understanding emotions? He would understand emotions. I guess the way he's responding may be different. We need to accept that and go with that. So I think we've crossed our time limit here. So I shall come to the end. I think there are no more questions. So thank you for all the questions that you've sent in. And thank you to Autism Connect for making this happen.